The archive at Gersu ends not with a declaration, but with a date that was never finished. The final administrative tablet from the 3rd dynasty of records grain distributions for the 4th month of a year whose name trails off into broken clay. There is no concluding formula, no ritual closing. The scribe simply stopped. What follows is not destruction. Archaeologists found no burn layer, no collapsed walls, but absence. The next datable text appears 2 generations later, in a different hand, using a modified system of accounting. Between them lies silence. This is not unusual. Across southern Mesopotamia, the great archives of the late 3rd millennium show similar fractures. At Umma, records cease mid-season during a year of temple offerings. At Puzrish Dagan, the massive livestock administrative complex, the final tablets enumerate thousands of animals being moved, sorted, redistributed, and then nothing. The animals were not slaughtered, the pens were not burned. The clay was simply left unfired, the work unfinished. What stops a bureaucracy in motion is rarely external force. It is the withdrawal of the system's centre. In Sumerian administrative culture, continuity itself was a form of order. Each tablet referred to the one before it. Each month name built upon the last. Year names were chosen to anchor the present to a completed act. The year the king dug the canal, the year the temple was roofed, the year the statue was brought in procession. These were not merely chronological markers, they were assertions that the world was still governed by intentional actions, that events could be named and therefore controlled. When the sequence breaks, it suggests not that something happened, but that something could no longer be named. The final year names of the Ur-3 period grow strange. They repeat themselves. They reference acts that other sources suggest were never completed. One year is named for a military campaign that is never mentioned again. Another commemorates the construction of a temple whose foundation deposits have never been found. These are not lies. They are attempts to maintain the form of continuity even as the substance dissolves. The year name was meant to anchor time, but what happens when time itself becomes unmoored? There is a tablet from Nippur, catalogued but rarely discussed, that lists temple personnel, priests, singers, doorkeepers, and beside each name a mark that Assyriologists translate as gone or absent. Not dead, not dismissed. The verb used, zigar, implies departure, separation, a motion away. It is the same verb applied in literary texts to gods who leave their sanctuaries. The list offers no explanation. It simply records that on a certain day these people were no longer present. The temple remained. The doors remained. The rituals, one assumes, did not. Elsewhere, tablets describe offerings made to gods who are not named, only listed by title. The one who dwelt in the Aeona, the lady of the upper chamber. This is not poetic variation. Sumerian scribes were precise. To withhold a name was to acknowledge a form of distance. The god was still recognized by role and location, but the intimacy of address had withdrawn. The offerings continued because the system required them, but the language suggests the scribes were no longer certain anyone was listening. Some archives do not end with silence, but with a shift in tone. At the final decades of the dynasty produced tablets that catalogue repeated redistributions of the same goods. Silver is measured, then remeasured. Workers are assigned to one foreman, then reassigned a week later. The archive begins to repeat itself, not because the information is important, but because the act of recording has become a way to simulate control. Bureaucracy, after all, is a language of continuity. When the world fractures, the scribes write faster. There is also the phenomenon of what some researchers call orphan tablets, texts with no administrative context, no matching archive, no institutional home. They are well written, formulaic, correct in every scribal convention, yet they appear in refuse heaps, in wall fill, in places where no archive should be. They were not discarded as trash. they were never filed. This implies they were written for a system that had already ceased to function, or for an authority that was no longer there to receive them. The scribe continued the work because the work itself was the order. And then, after the silence, the new tablets. They are smaller. The script is slightly different. The language is still Sumerian, but the syntax has shifted. New words appear for old concepts. Some terms simply vanish. The god lists are shorter. The king lists begin again, but with altered genealogies and revised chronologies. This is not the record of a conquest. It is the record of a system rebuilding itself in the absence of the one that came before. What is absent from these texts is not information. It is memory of cause. Later scribes, looking back, did not explain the silence. They did not write histories of collapse. Instead, they wrote myths of the time before the silence, stories of divine conflict, cosmic reorganization, the dispersal of the me, the flight of the gods. These stories were not placed in historical time. They were placed in the time before time, in the age when order was first established. This is how disruption was preserved, not as event, but as structure, not as history, but as the condition that made history necessary. So the question becomes, when does a record become evidence not of what happened, but of what could no longer be recorded? And if the silence in the archive mirrors the silence in the temple, what does that suggest about where the order came from? Sumerian has no single word for abandonment. Instead, it offers an array of verbs that describe motion away, each calibrated to context and agent. When a god departs a city, the verb is not the same as when a worker leaves a field or when water recedes from a canal. The language distinguishes not only the act, but the kind of absence left behind. This is not poetic flourish, it is grammatical infrastructure. The verb forms encode expectation, whether return is assumed, whether the absence is voluntary, whether the door was closed from the inside or the outside. The verb zigar appears often in temple inventories. It marks items removed from storage, goods sent onward, personnel transferred. In secular contexts, it is neutral. But when it is applied to divine statues, the meaning darkens. A divine statue that is zigar has been lifted, carried away. If this happens during a procession, it is ceremonial and temporary. But if it happens without ritual context, the word implies something else: relocation without return, presence that has been displaced. In a few late Ur-3 texts, the verb appears in passive constructions. The statue was caused to be lifted. By whom, the text does not say. Another verb, gur, means to return or to turn back. It is often paired with negatives in lamentation literature. The goddess does not gur to her temple. The protective deity does not gur to the gate. The structure of the sentence places emphasis not on the departure, but on the broken expectation of return. This implies that departure was understood as provisional. Gods were expected to move, to travel, to engage with other cities, but that return was the mechanism by which presence was sustained. When return ceased, the sentence itself became an accusation or a plea. Then there is dub, which means to encircle, to go around, but also to turn away. It is used in boundary contexts, in descriptions of walls and defensive circuits, but it also appears in theological formulations, particularly in incantations where the supplicant asks the god not to dub their face. The phrase is vivid: the god's face turns away, and the speaker is left outside the circuit of attention. The absence is not spatial, but relational. The god is still present in form, but the orientation has changed. This is not exile, it is neglect. The grammar itself encodes layers of agency. When a human subject performs zigar, the verb is transitive and active, but when a divine subject performs it, scribes sometimes use middle voice, a grammatical construction that suggests the subject acts upon itself or for its own purposes. The god lifts itself away. This is linguistically significant. It implies that the motion was not compelled by external force. It was chosen, or at least it was internal to the divine will. The text does not judge. it simply records the structure of the act. In some ritual laments, a phrase appears repeatedly, "the door that does not open." This is not metaphor. Sumerian temples had inner chambers where the divine statue resided, and access was restricted to priests of certain ranks at certain times. The phrase describes a door that remains closed beyond the expected time, a chamber that no longer cycles between presence and access. What is described is not destruction, the door still exists, but cessation of function. The chamber is intact, the god is not home. Another term, bashub, means to fall, to drop, or to be thrown down. In military contexts, it describes fortifications that collapse. In administrative texts, it describes grain spilling from a breached container. But in a handful of literary fragments, it is applied to cosmic structures. The bond between heaven and earth is described as having bashub, not severed, but fallen. The language suggests not an action taken by any party, but a structural failure, a weight that could no longer be borne. There is also the phrase en-nuzu, which appears in lamentation compositions. It translates roughly as lordship that is not known, or sovereignty that is not recognized. The verb zu, to know, is central to Sumerian intellectual culture. It means not just awareness, but intimate acquaintance, recognition, relationship. When applied to divine lordship, it suggests that the problem is not absence of the god, but absence of the connection through which lordship is enacted. The god may still exist, the bond does not. Linguists have noted that the late III and Isin-Lhasa periods show an increase in conditional and subjunctive grammatical forms in ritual texts. These are grammatical moods that express uncertainty, possibility, or contrary to fact situations. Earlier ritual formulas used declarative statements. The god will hear, the god does hear. Later formulas shift. May the god hear. If the god hears, should the god turn his ear? This is not a shift in belief, it is a shift in confidence. The ritual form remains, but the language now accommodates the possibility that the form might not be enough. Some of these verbs appear together in formulaic clusters, particularly in city laments composed after periods of political collapse. The god Ziga from the city does not gur, the door does not open, the face is dub. These clusters create a linguistic map of withdrawal, each verb marking a stage or dimension of separation. What they describe is not a single event, it is a process, or perhaps a recognition that what had always been understood as presence was in fact a continuous action, and that action could stop. Modern translations flatten this. They render these phrases as "the gods abandoned the city" or "divine protection was lost." But the Sumerian does not use a single verb for abandonment, and it does not frame the situation as loss. It frames it as a change in orientation, in attention, in the grammar of relationship. The temple still stands, the offerings are still made, but the syntax of the world has shifted, and the scribes have no choice but to adjust the language to match. What kind of disruption requires not a new vocabulary, but a new grammar? And if the withdrawal was encoded in the structure of the language itself, what were the scribes hearing, or not hearing, when they chose these forms? The Sumerian term for the divine council is unkin, which also means assembly, gathering, or collective deliberation. It appears in myths, hymns, and ritual formulations as the place where cosmic decisions are made, where fates are decreed, where the structure of the world is debated and affirmed. The council is not a metaphor. It is described with procedural precision. Members are named, seating is arranged, speech is regulated. There are senior gods who speak first, younger gods who listen, scribes who record. The Anunnaki, as a collective body, are frequently listed among those seated in the assembly. They do not rule it, but they constitute its quorum. Without them, the structure does not function. In the earliest literary references, the assembly meets regularly and reaches decisions. In the Eridu Genesis, the gods convene to address the problem of human noise. A decision is made, executed, and then revised. In Inanna's Descent, the council is convened to judge a transgression, and its ruling is final. The assembly is portrayed as effective, authoritative, and continuous. It is the mechanism through which divine will becomes cosmic order. The narrative grammar is declarative. The council decrees, and it is so. But in later texts, something shifts. The assembly is still invoked, still described, but it no longer completes its function. In the composition known as the Lament for the gods are depicted as gathering to address the fate of the city. Speeches are made. Ningal pleads for mercy. Enlil is addressed, but no decision is recorded. The text describes the assembly convening, the arguments being heard, and then shifts directly to the destruction. The gap is syntactic. The council meets, but does not decree, or if it decrees, the decree is not transmitted. There is a fragmentary text from Nippur that describes a council summoned to determine the fate of kingship. The opening lines are formulaic. The gods are named, the seats are filled, silence is called. Then the text breaks off. The reverse side of the tablet contains unrelated material. Whether the scribe never finished the composition, or whether the copy was made from a damaged original, the effect is the same. The assembly is convened, but never concludes. The structure remains, but the outcome is absent. In the Curse of Agade, a composition reflecting on the destruction of Akkad by Gutian incursion, the divine council is mentioned only in retrospect. The text describes the gods as having changed their word, as having turned their vision away. But it does not describe the moment of decision. There is no council scene. The shift is presented as already complete, a fact rather than a process. The narrative skips over the deliberation and presents only the aftermath. This is structurally unusual. Sumerian literary convention typically dramatizes the moment of decision. Here, the decision is treated as opaque. Another motif appears in administrative hymns from the late Ur-3 period. These compositions, which praise the king as the executor of divine will, frequently refer to the king standing before the assembly or receiving instruction from the gods in council. But the language becomes increasingly vague. Earlier hymns specify which god speaks and what is said. Later hymns say only that the king was given the word, or that he received the me from the assembly. The content of the exchange is no longer detailed. The authority is still claimed, but the narrative of how it was conferred becomes formulaic, almost evasive. There is also the case of fractured councils, scenes where the assembly meets, but its members disagree, defer, or fall silent. In a late version of the flood narrative, Enlil proposes destruction, but Enki opposes it. The text does not describe a resolution. Instead, it describes Enki acting independently, outside the framework of council decree. The structure of the assembly is present, but its function, collective decision-making, has broken down. The myth continues, but the cosmic order it depicts is no longer unified. The Anunnaki themselves are named inconsistently in these later assembly scenes. In earlier texts, they are listed among the great gods, or described as those who determine fates. But in later references, they are described as seated in the background, silent, or departed to their own districts. One fragmentary hymn from Isin refers to the Anunnaki as those who once fixed the borders. The verb is past tense. The function is acknowledged, but no longer active. The council's quorum is incomplete. Legal and ritual texts from the same period begin to describe human assemblies, city councils, temple administrators, using the same term, unkin, previously reserved for divine councils. This is not metaphor, it is functional replacement. Decisions that were previously understood as transmitted from the divine assembly are now described as being made by human councils acting in the place of, or on behalf of, the gods. The language does not claim usurpation, it claims necessity. The divine assembly has not been abolished, it has simply stopped meeting. One scholar has noted that the Sumerian particle name, meaning what is it, or why, begins to appear in later theological texts in contexts where it was previously absent. The particle signals a question without a clear answer. In older texts, divine actions are explained or justified. In later ones, the question is left open. Why did the gods turn away? What caused the assembly to be silent? The text poses the question, but provides no answer. The structure of inquiry remains, but the structure of response has fractured. Even in texts where the assembly is portrayed as intact, there is often a note of effort, of strain. The gods must be summoned repeatedly. Silence must be called multiple times. Decisions are described as difficult or delayed. In one late wisdom text, a scribe writes, "The assembly of the gods, who can understand it?" This is not pious humility. It is acknowledgement that the mechanism of cosmic order has become inscrutable. The assembly still exists, in theory. In practice, it has withdrawn into a silence the scribes can no longer interpret. If the divine council was understood as the structure through which order was maintained, what happens when the structure remains but ceases to function? And if the Anunnaki were the body that made the assembly operative, what does their silence mean? The Sumerian king list is not a history. It is a structure, a framework, through which kingship is understood as continuous, divinely mandated, and singular. The formula is consistent. Kingship descends from heaven. It is held by one city, then it moves to another. The transitions are smooth. One reign ends, the next begins. The list does not explain why kingship moves, it simply records that it does, and in doing so, implies that kingship itself is unbroken, even as its location shifts. This is not propaganda, it is ontology. Kingship exists. Cities hold it temporarily. The structure endures. But the list fractures. Between the fall of Ur-3 and the rise of Isin, the king list does not offer a clean transition. Multiple cities claim kingship simultaneously. Isin, Larsa, and several smaller centres all produce regnal lists, year names, and royal hymns, each asserting unbroken succession from the previous dynasty. There is no acknowledged overlap, no negotiation of legitimacy. Each tradition writes as if it alone holds the kingship. The structure that was meant to unify has splintered into parallel claims, none of which acknowledge the others. This is not merely political fragmentation. The language of kingship itself is disrupted. In earlier inscriptions, kings describe themselves as chosen by specific gods. An, Enlil, Inanna. The god is named, the act of selection is described, and the king's authority is grounded in that divine appointment. But in the Isin period, inscriptions become more circumspect. Kings describe themselves as called by name, but do not specify by whom. They claim to have received the scepter, but the giver is often left unstated or referred to only by title. The Great Lord, the one who dwells in the Ekur. The act is acknowledged, but the agent is obscured. There are also interruptions within dynasties. The Isin kings trace their legitimacy back to Ur-3 through genealogical and ritual ties. But the early Isin king list contains gaps, unnamed rulers, lengths of reign recorded as uncertain, interregnal periods marked only by the phrase, "Then kingship was in Isin," without specifying who held it. These are not copying errors. The gaps are consistent across multiple manuscripts. They suggest that for certain periods, the structure of kingship was maintained, but the identity of the king was unstable or contested. The office continued, the office holder did not. At Larsa, a similar phenomenon. The dynasty begins with strong claims of divine favour, particularly from the sun god Utu. But midway through the line, inscriptions shift in tone. Kings begin to describe their reigns in terms of restoration rather than inauguration. They claim not to have been chosen, but to have rebuilt what was abandoned, renewed what had decayed, returned the offerings that had ceased. The language suggests they understood themselves not as new appointees, but as caretakers of an order that had already fractured. One ruler, Ishbi-Erra, founder of the Isin dynasty, describes his rise in unusual terms. He does not claim descent from previous kings. He does not invoke election by the divine assembly. Instead, he describes himself as one who grasped the hand of the gods when the land was scattered. The verb dab, to seize or grasp, is not typically used in royal ideology. It implies initiative, not appointment. The language admits agency, even desperation. He acted because the structure was not functioning. Kingship did not descend, it was claimed. Other king lists from this period include anomalies that scribes could not explain. At Uruk, one list includes a ruler whose name is followed by the note, "His years are not known." At Eshnuna, a list records a king who ruled until the gods frowned, a phrase without parallel in earlier king lists, which record only regnal lengths and deaths, never causes. These are not neutral notations. They are admissions that the scribal apparatus could not reconstruct a coherent sequence. The structure of kingship was supposed to be linear. What they were recording was discontinuous. There is also the problem of contested year names. In the Isin-Lhasa period, two cities occasionally assign different names to the same calendar year, each referencing different royal acts, one commemorating a temple built at Isin, the other a victory claimed by Lhasa. This is not symbolic rivalry, it is structural incoherence. The calendar, like kingship, was meant to be singular. The fact that two versions existed simultaneously suggests that the apparatus of coordination, scribal schools, temple archives, royal administration, had lost its unifying centre. Late Ur III royal hymns describe kingship as something that must be held firm or kept from slipping. The verb gur, to roll or revolve, is used to describe kingship that is unstable, turning, about to tip. This is not the language of confident rulership. Earlier kings are described as standing firm, planted like a tree, immovable. The shift in metaphor is telling. Kingship has become something that requires effort to maintain, not something that is simply held by divine decree. There is a fragmentary text from Nippur that lists kings in sequence, but besides several names, the word nu-ub-dasar, meaning was not equal to it, or could not match it. The it is unstated, but contextually seems to refer to the office itself. These kings held the title, but the text suggests they did not fulfill the function. The structure was intact, but the weight it was supposed to bear could not be carried. One later Isin king, Damik-Ilishu, records in an inscription that he sought out the places where the gods had dwelt and inquired after the decrees that were no longer spoken. This is not the language of reform, it is archaeology. The king is described as searching for something that had been lost, trying to reconstruct a system of order that had ceased to function during his predecessors' reigns. He does not claim to have restored it, he claims only to have searched. If kingship is the structure through which divine order is administered on earth, what does it mean when the structure continues but its source becomes unclear? And if multiple kings can claim the same authority simultaneously, without resolution, what has happened to the centre from which that authority was supposed to descend? The ziggurat at Eridu was never finished. The core is intact, mud brick laid in neat courses, corners aligned, foundation deposits placed according to ritual prescription. But the outer casing stops halfway up the eastern face. The bricks are cut, shaped, stacked nearby. The bitumen for sealing is still in storage jars, hardened but present. There is no evidence of interruption by force, no scorch marks, no hastily buried tools, no skeletal remains. The work simply stopped. The structure is not ruined, it is incomplete. This is not unusual. Across late 3rd millennium southern Mesopotamia, temples and ritual complexes show similar patterns. Construction interrupted at critical stages, outer walls unfinished, courtyards half-paved, drainage systems incomplete. At Ur, the great terrace platform supporting the ziggurat of Nana was expanded during the reign of Ur-Nammu, but the expansion was never completed. The foundations were dug, the first courses laid, and then the work ceased. Later kings did not resume it. They built elsewhere, or not at all. At Girsu, excavation of the temple complex dedicated to Ningirsu reveals a curious feature. A second foundation trench, dug parallel to the first, never filled. The trench is clean, precise, ritually correct. Foundation pegs were driven at the corners, offerings were deposited, but no brick was ever laid. The trench remained open long enough to fill partially with wind-blown sand before it was finally covered over in a later rebuilding phase. This suggests the project was not abandoned due to external crisis. It was halted before construction began, despite the ritual groundwork having been completed. Sumerian temple construction was not merely a technical enterprise, it was a ritual process governed by celestial timing, divine approval, and scribal oversight. Each stage, site selection, purification, foundation rites, laying of the first brick, was accompanied by specific prayers, offerings, and textual invocations. Temples were described as being built at the command of a god, often transmitted through dream, omen, or oracle. The king was the builder, but the god was the architect. When construction stopped, it was not because labor or materials were lacking. It was because the process itself had been interrupted at the level of sanction. There are administrative tablets from that describe materials requisitioned for temple construction, timber, copper fittings, precious stones, being redirected elsewhere mid-project. The tablets do not explain why. They simply record the redistribution, often using the passive voice. The materials were taken, were sent, were allocated to another account. The project they were intended for is never mentioned again. This is not evidence of theft or corruption, it is evidence of priority shift. Something more urgent or more achievable took precedence. In some cases, construction did not stop, but changed. At Lagash, a temple precinct begun under one ruler shows two distinct construction phases within a single level. The first phase uses large, well-fired bricks and includes elaborate drainage. The second phase, stratigraphically continuous but stylistically distinct, uses smaller, poorly fired bricks and omits drainage entirely. The second phase is not a repair, it is a simplification. The plan was altered mid-execution, scaled down, made less ambitious. The temple was still built, but it was not the temple that had been planned. Another pattern: temples completed in form but never consecrated. At a small temple structure was excavated that contained offering tables, altars, and benches for divine statues. But no evidence of use. No ash in the hearths, no wear on the thresholds, no votive deposits in the foundation. The building was finished, but the rituals that would have activated it never occurred. The structure stood empty. This is not abandonment, it is incompletion at the level of function. Sumerian temple hymns describe the temple as the bond between heaven and earth, the place where divine presence could be localized and addressed. The building itself was not sacred until the deity was installed through ritual and invocation. A temple without its god was described using the term edua, a built house, but not ekur, a mountain house, which implied divine residence. The physical structure could exist, but the sacred function required something the structure alone could not provide. There are also cases where temple construction continued across multiple reigns, each king claiming credit for a different stage. But the inscriptions grow contradictory. One king claims to have completed a temple, his successor claims to have founded the same temple, the third claims to have restored it. Either the structure was rebuilt repeatedly, or the language of completion had become detached from the reality of the building. The act of claiming construction became more important than the act itself. A few texts describe kings commissioning temples, performing foundation rites, and then leaving the site. The construction is described as entrusted to the overseer, or given into the hands of the craftsman, but there is no record of royal return, no dedication ceremony, no record of divine installation. The king initiated the process, but did not see it through. This suggests a breakdown not in resources, but in confidence. The act of beginning was still ritually necessary. The act of completing had become uncertain. One inscription from the reign of Amarsuan describes a temple project as having been delayed by the silence of the oracle. The text does not elaborate, but the phrase is significant. Oracular silence means the divine will could not be discerned. Omens were unclear. Dreams were not forthcoming. The technical apparatus of construction was intact, but the ritual apparatus of authorization had failed. Without confirmation that the god desired the work could not proceed. In later periods, scribes looking back on these incomplete temples did not attribute them to war, disaster, or incompetence. They described them as structures waiting for the right time, or held in readiness. This is ambiguous language. It admits delay without assigning blame. It preserves the possibility of eventual completion while acknowledging that completion has not occurred. The temple remains a potential, not a fact. If a temple is the place where divine presence is mediated, and if that presence must be ritually installed, what happens when the installation does not occur? And if the king is the agent of divine will in construction, what does it mean when the king initiates but does not complete? Was the command withdrawn, or was it never fully given? The lament for describes destruction with precision and with absence. The city burns, the walls fall, the population is scattered, but the text never names the weapon. There is no mention of siege engines, battering rams, or scaling ladders. There is no description of swords, spears, or arrows. The destruction is absolute, but the means are invisible. What is named instead is the effect: fire, collapse, lamentation. The agent is described only as the storm, a term that appears in both natural and military contexts, but which here is never clarified. This is not poetic vagueness. Sumerian military texts, when describing human warfare, are specific. They list weapons, describe tactics, enumerate captives. Royal inscriptions detail the composition of armies: spearmen, archers, charioteers. Victory stelae depict weapons in carved relief. But texts describing destruction associated with divine judgment or cosmic disruption avoid this specificity. The language shifts from the concrete to the elemental. What destroys is wind, fire, darkness, silence. These are not metaphors, they are the only terms the texts use. In the Curse of Agaday, the destruction of Naram Sin's capital is attributed to the Gutians, a people from the highlands. But the text never describes the Gutians attacking. It describes them arriving, being given the land, acting as the storm that knows no mercy. The military act is displaced into natural language. The Gutians are described not as warriors, but as forces, chaotic, unstoppable, impersonal. This is how divine wrath is administered, not through armies, but through conditions that armies cannot resist. Another term appears frequently: Amaru, sometimes translated as flood, sometimes as annihilation. It is used in contexts where water is not literally present. The term describes something overwhelming, something that erases boundaries and distinctions. It is the opposite of me, which structures and defines. When a city is struck by Amaru, what is described is not drowning, but erasure. The structures remain, but the order is gone. There is also the phrase Igi Gal, literally great eye or terrible gaze. It appears in contexts where divine anger is turned toward a city or a king. The gaze does not strike, it observes, and in observing, something is undone. One text describes a king who stood before the great eye and his strength left him. Another describes a temple that fell under the great eye and could not rise. The gaze is a weapon, but not a physical one. It is a withdrawal of sustaining attention. Some incantations describe a category of affliction called Nam Erim, often translated as curse, but more accurately meaning sworn destruction or decreed annihilation. It is not imposed by a human enemy. It is activated by breaking a divine oath or violating sacred order. Once invoked, it operates autonomously. No human or divine agent need act. The violation itself generates the destruction. The texts describe Nam Erim as a force that cannot be turned back, cannot be undone, does not rest until it is fulfilled. This is not punishment administered, it is structure collapsing under its own weight. There is also the recurrent motif of the weapon of the gods, which is named but never described. In the Epic of Error, the god of plague wields a weapon called Shibu, which is glossed in lexical texts as a type of fever or burning. But the term also appears in ritual contexts as something that must be appeased, something that can be set loose or restrained. It is not an object, it is a condition, something that spreads through contact or proximity. The text describes it as having 7 mouths, but this is symbolic, not anatomical. The weapon is multiplication itself, each strike producing more. In another fragmentary text, a weapon is described as having been brought down from heaven, but sealed in the earth. The text does not describe its use, it describes its containment. The implication is that the weapon exists, but is not active. The threat is not deployment, but release. This suggests the weapon is not something that must be built or carried, it is something that must be kept dormant. There are also texts that describe destruction without agent. A temple is described as having fallen of itself. A wall is said to have turned against its own city. A river ceased to flow. These are not passive constructions, they are active statements of reversal. The structures that should protect instead harm. The systems that should function instead fail. This is not war, it is systemic inversion. One legal text from the Ur-3 period includes a clause describing damages caused by Ni2-Gal, often translated as great fear or terror. The clause specifies that if a field is abandoned due to Ni2-Gal, the tenant is not liable. The term is used elsewhere in omen texts to describe a state in which normal activity becomes impossible. People do not flee from danger, they simply cannot continue. The fear is not response to threat, it is itself the threat. A few texts describe a phenomenon called sagas, typically translated as brigandage or raiding. But the term is used in contexts where no raiders are mentioned. It describes a condition in which roads are impassable, fields are not worked, villages are empty, not because of active violence, but because of the absence of order. Sagas is not an enemy. It is what happens when the structures of protection and authority cease to function. The term describes the gap, not the cause. Later Mesopotamian traditions preserve the concept of the Anunnaki as judges of the dead, but also as wielders of cosmic judgment. One late Babylonian text describes them as those who hold the tablets of fate and do not show them, who stand in the shadows and do not speak. The image is not of warriors, but of overseers who have withdrawn oversight. The weapon is not what they do, it is what they no longer do. If destruction is described without naming the weapon, what kind of destruction is being recorded? And if the language used is elemental rather than military, does that suggest the scribes understood the collapse as structural rather than imposed? Sumerian celestial observation was not speculative, it was institutional. The movements of the stars, the phases of the moon, the positions of the planets, these were data recorded daily by temple scribes and analysed for patterns that governed ritual, agriculture, and political action. The sky was a text, and reading it correctly was part of maintaining the order. When omen texts describe celestial anomalies, they are not interpreting random events, they are recording disruptions to an expected pattern. But in the late Ur-3 and early Isin-Lhasa periods, the omen texts shift in tone. Earlier collections describe celestial phenomena as predictive. If the moon is eclipsed in a certain month, the king will die. If Venus appears in a certain position, the harvest will fail. These are conditional statements. The omen specifies both cause and consequence. But later omen texts become more ambiguous. They describe phenomena that should not occur, cannot be interpreted, or have no known meaning. The system of correspondence between sky and earth has fractured. One tablet from Nippur lists a sequence of lunar observations, but breaks off mid-entry with the phrase nuzu, not known. The scribe continues with the next month's observations, but the incomplete entry is never corrected or explained. This suggests the celestial event was observed, but could not be placed within the interpretive framework. The data was recorded, but the meaning was lost. This is not ignorance. It is the recognition that the pattern has broken. Another text describes a planetary alignment described as Namba anda Gi4, meaning it should never return. The phrase is not predictive, it is descriptive. The alignment is treated as a singular occurrence, something that falls outside the cyclical structure of celestial recurrence. If the heavens were understood as fundamentally regular, this is an admission that regularity itself has been interrupted. The Sumerian calendar was lunar, synchronized with the agricultural cycle through intercalation, adding extra months to keep the seasons aligned with the year. This was done according to observation and calculation, overseen by scribal schools and approved by temple authorities. But in the Isin-Lhasa period, calendars diverge. Different cities intercalate at different times. Some years are counted differently in different archives. This is not regional variation, it is systemic breakdown. The mechanism that kept the calendar synchronized across the entire region, scribal communication, central authority, shared observation, has ceased to function coherently. One scholar has noted that the term udzal, meaning daybreak or dawn, begins to appear in omen texts not as a time marker, but as a condition. Daybreak that does not arrive, dawn that is delayed, light that does not come at the expected time. These phrases are not literal, they describe a cosmological state, an expectation that is not fulfilled. The structure of time assumes a rhythm. When the rhythm falters, the language adjusts to describe not what happens, but what fails to happen. There are also texts that describe stars described as mulbazal, meaning faded star, or star that has passed away. These are not supernovae or comets. They are stars that were previously catalogued in observational lists, but are no longer visible. Some scholars suggest this reflects atmospheric change, dust from volcanic events, or long-term shifts in celestial visibility. But the scribes did not interpret it as natural, they interpreted it as loss. The star had been present, it was part of the known order, now it was not. The Anunnaki are mentioned in a few celestial contexts as those who fix the stations, establish the paths, or decree the order of heaven. These are not mythological flourishes, they describe a cosmological function, setting the parameters within which celestial motion occurs. In one fragmented hymn, a line reads, "The stations were fixed, but the paths have wandered." The phrasing admits continued structure, stations still exist, but describes a loss of adherence. The system is intact in theory, but not in observation. There are ritual texts that describe offerings made to stars, not as objects of worship, but as representatives of divine function. One text prescribes offerings to specific stars so that they continue their path, so that they do not stray, so that they remain where they are appointed. The language is not celebratory, it is preventive. The ritual is meant to sustain a function that can no longer be assumed. The stars might stray. The offerings are meant to prevent it. Some late omen collections include a category called Giskim B Nutuku, meaning an omen without consequence. These are celestial events that are observed and recorded, but which produce no discernible outcome. The eclipse occurs, but the king does not die. The planet rises at the expected time, but the harvest fails anyway. The correlation between heaven and earth, which was the foundation of Mesopotamian divination, has weakened. The sky still moves, but its authority over the earth is no longer reliable. Another motif, the second heaven. A few late texts describe a region of the sky described as Anbar, outer heaven, or distant heaven, where phenomena occur that do not follow the rules of the lower sky. These are not the fixed stars, which were well catalogued. These are transient lights, unexplained appearances, events that occur outside the zodiacal band and are therefore excluded from standard interpretation. The scribes did not ignore them. They created a separate category for them, a region of the sky that was observed but not governed. One tablet includes a note from a scribe that reads, "This sign was observed, but the meaning was not given." The passive construction is significant. Meaning was not something scribes invented. It was something transmitted, learned, preserved. If the meaning was not given, it implies a source of meaning that had ceased to communicate. The scribe could still observe, but the interpretive link between observation and significance had been severed. If the heavens were understood as the place where divine order was made visible, what does it mean when the visible no longer corresponds to the expected? And if celestial events could be observed but not interpreted, where had the system of interpretation come from, and where had it gone? Sumerian mathematics was not abstract, it was administrative, an apparatus for managing grain, tracking labour, calculating rations, distributing goods. Numerical tablets from the Ur-3 period describe a system of precision. Workers listed by name, their rations measured by the sealer, their output tracked monthly, their deficits noted. The math was clear, the accounting exact. The system did not generate surplus, it maintained balance. But in the final decades of the dynasty, the tablets tell a different story. The numbers shrink. At Girsu, a sequence of monthly ration tablets shows a gradual reduction in barley allocations. The first year, workers receive 6 sealer per month. The next year, 5. The third year, 4. The quantity decreases, but the worker count remains constant. There is no corresponding note of famine, no invocation of divine displeasure. The tablets simply record the adjusted amount and continue. The system adapts, but it does not explain why adaptation is necessary. There are also tablets that describe recalculations, rations being redistributed mid-month, workers being moved from one account to another, allocations being revised downward and then revised again. The scribes use the term la-tu, meaning reduction or deficit. The word appears with increasing frequency. What was previously surplus or reserve is now described as insufficient. The system has shifted from management to triage. One text from Umar lists temple personnel, and beside each name, a fraction, 1/2, 1/3, 1/4. These are not portions of a ration, they are reductions from a baseline. The worker is entitled to the full amount, but receives only a portion. The shortfall is not temporary. The text lists fractional rations for multiple consecutive months, then simply stops. The tablet does not describe what happened to the workers or whether they continued in service. It records only what they received and that it was not enough. Another administrative category appears, Lu-Hunga, translated as hired workers or temporary labourers. These are people not listed in the permanent workforce, not tied to specific workshops or estates. In earlier texts, such workers are rare, but in late Ur-3 records, they constitute an increasing proportion of the labour pool. The shift suggests that permanent employment structures have weakened. Workers are no longer integrated into the institutional system. They are paid piecemeal, task by task, in amounts that leave no surplus. There are also tablets describing goods allocated but not delivered. A scribe at Pusrish Dagan records silver distributed to merchants for the purchase of livestock, but the animals are never delivered. The entry is marked Nu G4A, not returned. The merchant has not disappeared. The silver was dispersed, but the exchange did not complete. The system assumes goods can be obtained through trade. The assumption has failed. One tablet records a recalculation of seed rations, grain reserved for planting, being drawn down and redistributed as food. The notation is brief. She numun bardziga. Seed grain was removed. The verb is passive, no agent is named. The decision is recorded as structural, not intentional. The system has begun consuming its future production to sustain the present. This is not a crisis response, it is the new normal. Texts also describe debt that cannot be repaid. A worker is listed as owing the temple a certain amount of barley, equivalent to several months' labour. But subsequent tablets show the debt increasing, not because the worker has borrowed more, but because the system is compounding interest or calculating deficits retrospectively. The worker is not dismissed, the debt is simply carried forward. The temple system has become a creditor, and the labour force has become a debtor class. There is a term, nig kas, aka, meaning balanced account or settled reckoning. It appears in earlier texts as a routine formula. Accounts were checked, discrepancies resolved, balances cleared. But in late Ur-3 tablets, the term appears with negations. Nig kas, nu ak. Accounts were not balanced. The text continues with the usual list of transactions, but the closure formula is missing. The system is still functioning, but it can no longer reconcile itself. The math no longer adds up. Another pattern, tablets that record distributions on the authority of a named official, but the official's title is listed as Lu Nu Zu, unknown person, or person without designation. The official exists, they issued the order, but the system no longer recognizes their authority within its categories. They are outside the structure, yet the structure obeys them. This suggests improvisation, decisions being made by those not formally empowered because those who were empowered are absent. A few tablets include retrospective recalculations, earlier months' rations being adjusted after the fact, not because of error, but because the baseline has changed. A worker who was allocated 6 sealer in month 1 is retroactively listed as having received only 4, and the difference is transferred to the account of another official. The scribes are not correcting mistakes, they are rewriting history to match present shortage. One text describes a workforce described as Lu Tu Tur, reduced people, or those who have lessened. The term is not social status, it is administrative condition. The workers are still counted, still allocated rations, but at diminished levels. They have not left the system has diminished them. The phrasing suggests not individual failure, but systemic contraction. There are also tablets that list goods in storage, but the amounts are marked with the sign She 3, which can mean either expected or imagined. The goods are counted but not physically present. The archive treats them as real because the system requires them to exist. The math assumes a baseline of stored wealth. When the wealth is absent, the math continues, but the sign changes. One late tablet from Gersu lists a single entry. Rations, none. Workers, as before. The system acknowledges collapse in the supply side, but maintains the administrative structure of the demand side. The workers are still counted. Their entitlement is still recognized, but the system can no longer fulfill it. This is not abandonment, it is paralysis. If the administrative system is the mechanism through which cosmic order is reflected in material distribution, what does it mean when the numbers no longer balance? And if the rationing system was designed to maintain stability, what happens when stability requires shrinking the ration itself? The laws of Ur-Nammu are not the first Sumerian laws. They are the first preserved attempt to codify legal practice as restoration. The prologue is unusual. It does not claim divine authorship of the laws themselves. Instead, it describes Ur-Nammu as one who established justice in the land, who freed the sons and daughters of Nippur, of Ur, of Isin from servitude, who ensured the orphan did not fall to the wealthy, the widow did not fall to the powerful, the man of 1 shekel did not fall to the man of 1 mina. The language is defensive. It assumes exploitation, imbalance, abuse. The law code is not inaugurating a new order. It is attempting to restore one that has been lost. The law itself is structured around compensation, not punishment. If a man breaks another's bone, he pays silver. If a man cuts off another's foot, he pays silver. The code specifies amounts, but the amounts are not punitive, they are restorative, calculated to return the injured party to their prior condition, insofar as that is possible. The law assumes that balance can be mathematically restored, that harm can be quantified and offset. This is not the logic of retribution, it is the logic of accounting. There is also a focus on thresholds. The code specifies when a slave may be freed, when a debt may be forgiven, when a contract may be dissolved. The thresholds are not arbitrary. They describe social breaking points, conditions under which the normal structures of obligation become unbearable. The law does not prevent these thresholds from being reached. It specifies what must happen once they are. One clause describes what happens if a man's house is destroyed by flood. The text does not describe the flood as a divine judgment. It treats it as a calculable risk. The man is released from certain obligations, his creditors are temporarily restrained, his household is reconstituted under modified terms. The law assumes disaster. It prepares for aftermath. Another clause addresses the situation in which a temple worker cannot fulfill their assigned duties due to fear of the divine presence. The phrasing is precise. The worker is not dismissed. They are reassigned to duties that do not require proximity to the inner temple. The law acknowledges that religious terror can incapacitate, and it provides procedural relief. This is not theology. It is personnel management in the context of sacred trauma. The code also includes provisions for years of silence, periods in which legal disputes cannot be resolved because the normal apparatus of judgment is not functioning. During these periods, contracts are suspended, debts do not accrue, and testimony is preserved but not acted upon. The law assumes that the system itself may periodically cease to function. It does not explain why. It simply provides a framework for what to do when it happens. There is a phrase that appears in several clauses, niga sisa, meaning just thing or right order. The term is not moral, it is structural. It describes the condition in which each element of society, worker, landowner, temple, king, occupies its proper place and receives its proper due. The laws are designed to restore niga sisa when it has been disturbed. The disturbance is assumed, the restoration is the goal. The Lipit Ishtar code, which follows Ur-Nammu by several generations, continues this pattern, but with adjustments. It includes more clauses about land that has been abandoned, property that has no clear owner, families that have been scattered. The code specifies how such situations are to be resolved, how ownership can be reconstituted, how inheritance can be traced when the chain has been broken. These are not theoretical concerns, they are the concerns of a society attempting to rebuild social continuity after it has fractured. One section of the code describes how to determine whether a temple has been deserted by its god. The determination is not based on oracle or omen, it is based on observable criteria, whether offerings have been interrupted for a specified period, whether priests have departed, whether the structure has been breached. If these conditions are met, the temple's property may be redistributed, its obligations dissolved. The law does not judge whether the god has truly departed, it simply provides a legal standard for acting as if they have. Another clause addresses the situation in which a king dies without clear succession and multiple claimants arise. The code does not establish a rule of succession, it establishes a process for adjudication. Testimony is gathered, genealogies are examined, oaths are administered. The law assumes contested kingship. It does not prevent it. It provides a mechanism for resolving it once it has already occurred. There are also clauses about things that were and are no longer. These describe goods, offices, or titles that existed in earlier times but which no longer function. The law specifies that such things may be held in memory but cannot be claimed as binding obligations. This is legal recognition of discontinuity. The past is acknowledged, but it is not enforceable. The present has changed, and the law adjusts. One clause specifies that a scribe may refuse to witness a contract if the words are not in accordance with the old documents. This is significant. It implies that scribal authority rests on adherence to tradition, and that tradition itself is a legal standard. But it also implies that contracts are being proposed that deviate from tradition, and that scribes are being asked to authorize them. The law supports the scribe's refusal. It protects the integrity of the archive against innovation. Another section describes legal remedies for collective fear. If a village or district ceases to function because the population has fled or withdrawn, the law specifies that the land may be reassigned, the obligations transferred, the settlement reconstituted elsewhere. The law does not ask why the fear arose. It assumes fear can be a collective, socially disabling condition, and it provides legal tools for responding to it. The codes do not claim to be comprehensive. They are described as examples or precedents, not as exhaustive statutes. The prologue to the Lipit Ishtar Code describes the laws as being established so that justice might be known, not so that all possible disputes might be resolved. The law is a framework for reasoning, not a complete system. The assumption is that disruption will continue, and the law must be adaptable. If law is the human codification of divine order, and if these laws anticipate collapse, does that suggest the scribes understood divine order itself as fragile? And if the laws are structured around restoration rather than inauguration, what prior collapse are they restoring from? Sumerian medical texts are not diagnostic in the modern sense. They describe conditions, but the conditions are often described by effect rather than cause. The patient cannot eat, cannot sleep, cannot speak, cannot leave the house. These are not symptoms of a single illness. They are states of incapacitation, each requiring its own ritual, each addressed through incantation, offering, or purification. The medicine is not pharmacological, it is relational. The body is treated as permeable to forces, divine, demonic, environmental, and healing is the restoration of proper boundaries. But in the late Ur-3 and Isin-Lhasa periods, the texts shift. A new category appears, Nigal, often translated as great fear or divine terror. It is not fear of a specific thing, it is fear as a condition, something that afflicts individuals or groups without identifiable cause. One text describes a man who cannot go out into the street, who sees the shadows and turns back, who hears the wind and trembles. The incantation does not name what he fears. It treats the fear itself as the affliction. There are also collective syndromes. One tablet describes a village where no one speaks, where the children do not cry, where the animals do not graze. The text does not attribute this to disease or invasion. It describes it as Namlu Ulu Bazar. Humanity has fled. The phrase is not metaphorical. It describes a psychological evacuation, a state in which human presence is maintained in form, but not in function. The people are still there. They are no longer themselves. Another term appears, A2 Sag3 Ga, meaning struck in the limbs or weakness of the body. But the term is used in contexts where no physical injury is mentioned. The patient is described as unable to work, unable to rise, unable to perform normal tasks, not because of illness, but because the strength has left. One incantation asks, who has taken the strength? Who has loosened the sinews? Who has turned the face away? The questions are not rhetorical. The incantation is structured as inquiry, seeking to name the agent so that it can be addressed. Some medical texts describe conditions described as Shag4 Hulgal, great sickness of the heart. This is not cardiac distress. The Sumerian Shag4 means heart, but also interior, mind, intention. The sickness is internal, invisible, unnamable. One text describes the patient as like one who has seen the face of a god and cannot forget it. The phrasing is ambiguous. Seeing the divine face is elsewhere described as blessing. Here it is pathology. The contact was too direct. The mind cannot recover. There are also texts that describe what we might now call contagion of effect. One incantation is prescribed for a house where no one laughs, where the mood is heavy, where the air does not move. The treatment is not for an individual, but for a space. Offerings are made at the threshold, incense is burned in the corners, water is sprinkled in a specific pattern. The house is being purified not of physical contamination, but of something else, something the text calls hul, meaning evil, but also disorder, wrongness, imbalance. Another text describes a condition called gidim hul, evil ghost. But the ghost is not the spirit of a dead person. It is something formless, something that sits on the chest, closes the throat, makes the night endless. The text specifies that this is not caused by personal sin or broken taboo. It is described as gidim nuzu, a ghost that is not known. The affliction is real, the source is opaque. One tablet prescribes an incantation for one who fears the assembly. The patient is described as unable to speak in public, unable to enter the gate of the temple, unable to stand before authority. The incantation does not ask the gods to remove the fear. It asks them to make the heart firm, to restore the face, to give back the voice. The treatment assumes the patient once had these capacities. They have been lost, and the ritual seeks to restore them. There is also a recurring phrase, Dingir Rana Ba'an Kur. His god has become strange to him. This is used to describe a state in which the individual's personal deity, the minor protective god assigned to each person, has withdrawn or become unrecognizable. The result is described as vulnerability, instability, susceptibility to harm. The person is not abandoned by all gods, but the specific god who should be proximate has turned away, and the person is exposed. Another text describes a syndrome called Lutu Kalla, the strong man, but the term is used ironically. The patient is described as rigid, immovable, unable to bend or yield. The incantation does not ask for strength, it asks for release, for flexibility, for the ability to become soft again. The text implies that the condition is a response to prolonged threat. The body has hardened itself and now cannot relax. Some texts describe children who do not grow, who remain silent, who turn their faces to the wall. The condition is not physical malnutrition. The children eat, but do not thrive. One incantation asks, what has frightened the child in the womb? What has the child seen that has closed its mouth? The text implies prenatal trauma, something experienced before birth, that shapes the child's capacity to engage with the world. There are also texts for those who dream without ceasing, who cannot distinguish waking from sleeping, who see what is not there. The incantations describe this not as madness, but as EGB Nusa, the eye that does not clear. The boundary between inner and outer vision has failed. The patient is trapped in a liminal state, neither fully present nor fully absent. One text includes a prayer addressed to the Anunnaki, asking them to lift the hand that has fallen on the patient. The phrase Shu-gal, great hand, is used elsewhere to describe divine authority or judgment. Here it is experienced as pressure, weight, something that must be lifted so the patient can move again. The prayer does not ask why the hand fell, it asks only that it be removed. Another incantation describes a condition called munus sua, the drained woman, or the emptied one. The patient is described as having given too much, poured out too often, become hollow. The treatment involves ritual filling. Water is drunk, grain is eaten, oil is anointed, not as nourishment, but as symbolic reconstitution. The body is being ritually restored to capacity. If illness can be caused by collective fear, divine withdrawal, or unbearable presence, what does that suggest about the relationship between social order and bodily integrity? And if the medical texts describe syndromes that have no physical symptom but are nonetheless disabling, what kind of collapse are they recording? At Ur, there is a layer of silt, clean, sterile, culturally empty, deposited sometime in the early 3rd millennium. It is 8 feet thick in some places, thinner in others. Beneath it, houses. Above it, houses. The architecture shifts, the pottery styles change, but the silt itself contains nothing. No broken vessels, no ash, no bones, just sediment. Leonard Woolley, who excavated it in the 1920s, called it evidence of the flood. But the layer is local, not regional. It does not appear at Uruk, 50 miles away. It does not appear at Eridu, 10 miles to the south. It is a flood, but not the flood. There are similar layers at other sites, Shuruppak, Kish, Lagash, but they are not contemporary. The silt at Kish dates earlier than the silt at Ur. The layer at Lagash is later still. These are not the record of a single event. They are the record of many events, separated by centuries, each local, each catastrophic for the settlement it affected, but none universal. The Mesopotamian floodplain was, and is, prone to flooding. Rivers shift course, levees break, cities drown. This is hydrology, not mythology. But the literary tradition remembers a single flood. The Sumerian flood story, preserved in fragments and later retold in Akkadian as the Atrahasis and the Epic of Gilgamesh, describes a cosmic decision to destroy humanity, a single survivor, a boat, a divine reprieve, and the re-establishment of order. The story is not localized, it is universal. All cities are destroyed, all humanity is lost, except the chosen. This is not how archaeology records flooding. So where does the story come from? One possibility is that the story is a literary synthesis, multiple local disasters compressed into a single narrative and projected backward into mythic time. This would explain why the flood traditions contain geographic specificity. The boat lands at Nisir, a known mountain. Alongside cosmic scale, all gods are involved, all life is at stake. The story carries the memory of real events, but it has been reshaped to serve a theological purpose, to explain not how a city flooded, but why order itself required re-establishment. But there is a curious gap. The Sumerian king list, which records dynasties before and after the flood, places the flood as a chronological divider. After the flood, kingship descended from heaven once more. But the list does not describe the flood. It simply marks it as the boundary between two eras. The dynasties before the flood are described as impossibly long, kings reigning for thousands of years. The dynasties after the flood are historically plausible. The flood is not an event. It is a threshold between mythic and historical time. This suggests the flood narrative is not about water. It is about discontinuity. The story is a way of explaining why the present order does not seamlessly connect to the past, why the old dynasties and their immense reigns cannot be reconciled with the known world. The flood is the narrative device through which the break is formalized. Something ended, something began. The flood is the name given to the gap. Archaeological destruction layers tell a different story. At Shuruppak, the site is abandoned after a flood layer, but the abandonment is not total. Some structures are reoccupied, some are not. The city continues, but smaller, diminished. At Ur, the post-flood settlement is not a new city. It is the same city, rebuilt. The inhabitants return. They do not start from scratch. They dig foundations into the silt and resume. This is not the narrative of the flood myth, which describes total erasure and singular survival. But there are other destruction layers that are not floods. At Lagash, there is a burn layer, ash, charcoal, collapsed mud brick, dated to the late 3rd millennium. At Uruk, walls show signs of hasty repair and later abandonment. These are not the result of water, they are the result of fire, perhaps conflict, perhaps accident, perhaps both. But they are not mythologized. There is no story of the Great Fire, no narrative of cosmic combustion. The literary tradition preserves the flood, but not the burn. Why? One possibility is that flooding, unlike burning, left the temples relatively intact. Mud brick dissolves in prolonged water, but sacred precincts were often elevated on platforms. The temple of Nana at Ur sits on a terrace that kept it above the flood silt. When the water receded, the temple remained. But if the temple survives, then the god's presence survives, and the continuity of order is preserved. Fire, by contrast, leaves nothing. If the archive burns, the memory burns. If the temple burns, the presence is lost. There are texts that describe restoration after disaster, but they do not describe the disaster itself. One inscription from the early 2nd millennium describes a king who returned the gods to their places, who restored the offerings that had ceased, who rebuilt what the enemy had destroyed. But the enemy is not named. The destruction is not detailed. The text focuses on restoration, not ruin. The disaster is reduced to a premise. Something happened, and now it must be undone. Another text describes a temple whose foundation had been forgotten, whose door had been closed for years without count. The structure still stands, but its function has lapsed. The text does not explain why. It simply records the king's act of reopening, of reconsecrating, of making the temple live again. The closure is described as having no known cause. It simply was. There is also the phenomenon of narrative displacement. Events that occur in historical time, invasions, droughts, plagues, are sometimes retold in mythological time, assigned to the distant past, removed from the chronological record. This allows the memory to be preserved without the specificity. The event becomes a template, a repeatable pattern, rather than a singular occurrence tied to a particular king or year. The flood functions this way. It is not denied, it is universalized. The flood layers themselves are silent. They do not contain tablets explaining what happened. The texts that do exist, administrative records from before and after, show only absence. The archive stops. The next archive begins. Between them, silt. The literary tradition fills that silence with story. The story is not false, but it is not descriptive, it is interpretive. If the flood is remembered, but the burn layers are not, what does that suggest about which kinds of destruction could be narrativized and which could not? And if the archaeological record shows many local floods, but the literary tradition preserves one universal flood, does that suggest the story is not about water, but about something else the water came to represent? A temple archive from Isin, dated to the early 2nd millennium, contains a curious tablet. It is a personnel list: priests, singers, bakers, weavers, but besides several names, the notation Dingir B Nugal, his god, does not exist. Not his god has left, not his god is angry, but does not exist. The notation is administrative, not theological. The person is still employed, the offerings are still made, but the protective relationship between individual and deity has been severed, and the archive records it as a fact. This is part of a broader shift. In the late Ur-3 period, temple administration had been centralized, standardized, and tightly controlled. Offerings were calculated to the grain, personnel were rotated according to strict schedules, and the flow of goods was recorded in duplicate and triplicate. The system assumed continuous divine oversight. Gods were present, rituals were effective, and the offerings sustained cosmic order. But in the Isin Lhasa period, the administrative tone changes. The system continues, but the assumptions weaken. One text describes offerings described as Nigiba Nuzu, gifts that are not known, meaning the recipient is unspecified. The offering is made according to form, but the god who should receive it is not named or cannot be named. The ritual structure is maintained, but the relational structure has dissolved. The scribe records the expenditure, but does not claim the offering was accepted. There are also texts describing temples run in the absence of the Lord. The phrase ennu mea, when the Lord is not, appears in administrative contexts where decisions are being made by priests or scribes who would normally defer to divine instruction through oracle, dream, or omen. The decisions are still made, the work continues, but the authority structure has shifted from divine to human to human to human. Another category, surrogate offerings. One tablet describes a statue being dressed, fed, and honoured in place of the god. The statue is not the god, it is a placeholder. The ritual proceeds as if the god were present, but the text specifies that the god is not. The scribe does not explain where the god is. The ritual simply compensates for the absence. Some archives describe redistribution of temple property, land, livestock, stored grain, being allocated to secular authorities for the maintenance of order. The phrase nigi sisa tilla, for the completion of justice, is used to justify the transfer. The temple's economic function is being absorbed into the state, not through conquest or secularization, but through necessity. The temple system no longer has the capacity to fulfill its redistributive role. The state assumes it. There are also texts describing reduced ritual calendars. Earlier temple archives list dozens of festivals, each with specific offerings, each tied to lunar phases, agricultural cycles, or historical commemorations. But in the Isin Lhasa period, the calendar shortens. Festivals are combined. Some are listed as suspended until the return. The return of what? The text does not say. The phrase is left open, as if the answer were too obvious or too painful to specify. Another shift. Scribes begin to describe themselves not as servants of the gods, but as preservers of the word, or keepers of the tablet. The identity is no longer relational, scribe to deity, but archival, scribe to text. The authority of the scribe is no longer derived from proximity to divine instruction. It is derived from custody of the written record. The scribe's role is no longer to transmit the will of the gods, it is to preserve what the gods once said. One tablet contains a fragmentary colophon that reads, "Written so that it is not forgotten, though no one understands it." The phrasing is striking. The text is not pedagogical. It is not meant to instruct future scribes. It is meant to persist, even if meaning is lost. The act of preservation has become detached from the act of comprehension. The archive is no longer functional. It is memorial. There are also texts describing orphan temples, structures that still receive offerings, but whose patron deity is described as Dingir Nu Zu, God not known. The temple exists, rituals continue, but the god who once inhabited it is no longer named, or is named only by epithet, by location, by absence. The cult continues not because the god is present, but because the structure of continuity requires it. Some archives show evidence of scribal consolidation, multiple temple archives being merged into a single location, their records copied and combined. This is not centralization for efficiency, it is preservation against loss. The smaller archives are no longer sustainable, their personnel have dispersed, their buildings have decayed, their functions have ceased. The larger archive absorbs them, not to use them, but to keep them from disappearing entirely. One text describes a ritual performed according to the old tablet, but the old tablet is described as imdua, damaged clay. The ritual is being performed from a text that is fragmentary, unclear, perhaps misunderstood. The scribe admits the uncertainty, but the ritual proceeds. The form is more important than the accuracy. The act of continuity outweighs the act of correctness. There is also evidence of local innovation. Temples begin to compose new hymns, new prayers, addressed to gods described in localized terms. The one who protects this gate, the one who hears in this chamber. These are not the great cosmic deities, they are minor figures, domestic, immediate, perhaps newly invoked to fill the gap left by the withdrawal of the greater gods. The religious structure adapts, but the adaptation is fragmentation. Another pattern, scribal families. In earlier periods, scribal schools trained students from many backgrounds, producing a literate class dispersed across institutions. But in the Isin Lhasa period, scribal training becomes hereditary. Knowledge is passed father to son, confined to specific families, embedded in lineage. The system of institutional training has weakened, the family becomes the archive. One text describes a scribe who wrote what was no longer said. The verb tense is past. The content is not new revelation, it is old instruction, recorded after the source has ceased to speak. The scribe is not transmitting, the scribe is remembering. The tablet is not a communication, it is a monument. If the administrative apparatus is the mechanism through which divine will is enacted in the material world, what does it mean when that apparatus continues, but the will is no longer transmitted? And if the scribes shift from servants of the gods to custodians of memory, what does that suggest about where authority now resides? The Hittite texts describe something called the disappearing god motif. Telepinu, the god of agriculture, becomes angry and departs. The crops fail, the animals do not reproduce, humanity suffers. The gods search for him. When he is found, he is appeased, and he returns. The motif is not unique to Telepinu. Several Hittite deities are described as disappearing and requiring retrieval. The pattern is formulaic: anger, departure, search, return. The texts do not describe war among the gods, but they describe divine absence as disruptive to cosmic function. This is structurally similar to Sumerian lament traditions, where gods are described as departing their cities and refusing to return until ritual satisfaction is achieved. The difference is one of outcome. In the Hittite material, the god always returns. In Sumerian laments, return is hoped for, but not assured. The Hittite myths are restorative. The Sumerian laments are unresolved. In Ugaritic tradition, there is a conflict between Baal and Mot, between storm and death. Baal descends into the underworld, and during his absence, the earth becomes barren. Anat, his sister, retrieves him, and life resumes. The cycle is annual, tied to the agricultural calendar, but the structure is significant. Divine absence causes earthly dysfunction, and divine return restores it. The gods do not abandon permanently. They cycle between presence and absence. Mesopotamian tradition, by contrast, does not present divine absence as cyclical. In the Sumerian material, when a god departs, there is no assurance of return. The lament is not seasonal, it is historical or post-historical. It describes something that happened once and was not corrected. The departure is not part of a cycle, it is rupture. In Egyptian tradition, there is the concept of Isfet, the opposite of Ma'at. Ma'at is order, balance, truth. Isfet is chaos, disorder, falsehood. The pharaoh's role is to maintain Ma'at by performing rituals, making offerings, and upholding justice. If Ma'at fails, Isfet encroaches. But the gods themselves do not depart. They may be neglected, angered, or offended, but they do not withdraw from their cosmic roles. The structure remains intact. In the Hebrew Bible, there is a different pattern. God withdraws his presence as a response to covenant violation. The ark is captured, the temple is destroyed, the people are exiled. But the withdrawal is not permanent, and it is not silent. Prophets explain it. The withdrawal is pedagogical, corrective. It is meant to provoke repentance and eventual return. The structure is broken, but the relationship is not. What is distinctive about the Sumerian material is that the withdrawal is neither explained as punishment nor promised as temporary. The gods depart, or turn away, or fall silent, and the texts do not claim to know why. The explanations offered, broken oaths, human noise, divine conflict, are tentative, inconsistent. No single cause is universally affirmed. The withdrawal is treated as event, not as lesson. There is also the matter of the Anunnaki. In Sumerian and Akkadian texts, they are described as a collective body of gods, often associated with the underworld, judgment, and the determination of fates. In later Babylonian tradition, they are increasingly associated with the dead, with the underworld's bureaucracy, with judgment that occurs after death rather than during life. Their function shifts from cosmic governance to afterlife administration. This is not a promotion, it is a demotion, or a reassignment. In the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, the Anunnaki are present but secondary. Marduk is the active deity, the one who establishes order by defeating Tiamat. The Anunnaki acclaim him, but they do not create. They witness, they affirm. Their role is reduced to chorus. This is very different from earlier Sumerian depictions, where the Anunnaki are described as active determiners of fates, participants in the assembly, agents of cosmic structure. There are also parallels in Greek tradition, the Titans, who once ruled, but were overthrown and imprisoned. The structure is similar, an older generation of divine beings displaced by a younger one, confined to a different cosmic location. But in Greek tradition, the displacement is agonistic. There is war, conflict, victory. The Titans are defeated. In Sumerian tradition, the Anunnaki are not defeated. They withdraw or are withdrawn. The language is different. In Zoroastrian tradition, there is the concept of Deva, spirits who are opposed to the order of Ahura Mazda. But the Deva are not former gods. They are intrinsically opposed. There is no memory of a time when they were part of the cosmic order. In Mesopotamian tradition, the Anunnaki were once integral, and then they were not. The shift is remembered. One later text from the Neo-Assyrian period describes the Anunnaki as those who were seated in the assembly of old. The verb is past tense. The assembly continues, gods still convene, but the Anunnaki are no longer part of it. They are historical, not functional. They belong to an earlier structure, not the present one. In Jewish pseudepigraphal literature, particularly First Enoch, there are the Watchers, angels who descended, mingled with humanity, taught forbidden knowledge, and were subsequently punished and bound. The narrative structure is similar. Divine beings who were once part of the heavenly order, who transgressed or withdrew, and whose departure resulted in disruption on earth. But the tone is moral. The Watchers are condemned. The Anunnaki are not. There is also the phenomenon of memory without continuity. In later Greek philosophy, there are references to gods who have departed, or old gods no longer worshipped. But these are treated as cultural shifts. People stopped believing, people turned to new gods. In Mesopotamian tradition, the departure is not cultural, it is structural. The gods did not lose worshippers, they withdrew function. If multiple traditions preserve memories of divine conflict, displacement or withdrawal, but each interprets it differently, what does that suggest about the events behind the memory? And if the Sumerian material is distinctive in its refusal to resolve the departure, does that suggest the scribes understood the disruption as irreversible? The scribal curriculum at Nippur included a text called the Sumerian Temple Hymns, a collection of 42 hymns praising temples across the land. Each hymn describes the temple's structure, its deity, its function. But the hymns are not contemporary. They are retrospective. Some of the temples described no longer existed when the text was composed. Some of the cities were in ruins. The hymns were copied, taught, memorized, not as guides to active temples, but as memories of what temples once were. This is the function of the late Sumerian literary tradition, preservation without restoration. The texts do not claim the old order can be brought back. They claim it can be remembered. The difference is significant. Restoration implies the structure is still viable, that the right rituals or the right king can return things to how they were. Memory implies the structure is past, that it can be honoured but not reactivated. One genre that proliferates in the Isin Lhasa period is the city lament. These are long, repetitive, highly formulaic compositions that describe the destruction of cities, Nippur, Eridu, Sumer as a whole. The destruction is attributed to divine decision, often described as the execution of a decree made by the assembly of the gods. But the lament does not ask why the decree was made. It describes the suffering, catalogues the loss, and ends with a plea, not for reversal, but for acknowledgement. Another common feature, the lament describes the city in the present tense, as if it is still in ruins, even when the city has been partially rebuilt. The text does not describe restoration, it dwells in the aftermath. This is not mourning that seeks closure, it is mourning that sustains itself, that ritualizes the memory of loss so that it is not forgotten. There are also texts called ballage, which are ritual laments performed during temple rites. These are not responses to specific disasters, they are calendrical. They are performed on certain days at certain times, whether or not anything has been destroyed. The ritual structure assumes that lamentation is a necessary part of order, not a response to disorder. The lament is not corrective, it is constitutive. One fragment from a Nippur school text includes the phrase, Nam lu ulu ba until. Humanity was completed, or humanity was finished. The verb till can mean to finish, to complete, or to end. The phrase is ambiguous. Humanity has ended, or humanity has been brought to completion. The text does not resolve the ambiguity. It simply teaches the phrase as something students must copy, memorize, and transmit. Another pedagogical text lists the names of the Anunnaki in sequence, followed by the phrase Nin dibi nuzu. Their nature is not known. The student is taught the names, but also taught that the names no longer connect to knowable entities. The act of naming is preserved, but the act of knowing is acknowledged as lost. This is memory as structure, not memory as content. There are also texts that describe knowledge, described as nam kuzu, sacred knowledge, or pure knowledge, but which is said to have been hidden, sealed, or taken back to heaven. The knowledge once existed, it was transmitted, practiced, effective. Now it is inaccessible. The texts do not claim it was lost through human failure. They describe it as having been withdrawn. One late wisdom text includes the phrase, Mi kura nam bada angi. The foreign lands will not return them. The antecedent is unstated. Who or what will not return? The phrase is formulaic, repeated in multiple contexts, but never clarified. It is assumed the reader knows, or it is assumed the ambiguity is the point. Another motif, scribes describing their work as like building in ruins, or like gathering scattered stones. The metaphor is architectural, but the work is textual. The scribe is not constructing something new. The scribe is attempting to reconstitute something that has broken apart. The archive is no longer a living system. It is a ruin being sorted, catalogued, partially rebuilt, not for use, but for memory. There are also texts described as ka inim ma, incantations of the mouth, which are described as effective only if spoken in the Old Tongue. But the Old Tongue is Sumerian, and by the second millennium, Sumerian was no longer a spoken language. It was a scribal language, learned in schools, used in ritual, but not used in daily life. The incantation must be spoken in a language that is no longer living. The ritual is preserved, but its efficacy is uncertain. One colophon reads, Let the wise understand, let the learned teach, let the king who comes after know what was before. The phrasing is imperative, but the fulfillment is deferred. The understanding, the teaching, the knowing, these are projected into the future. The present is not described as a time of understanding, it is described as a time of preservation. Another text includes the phrase, Anna Amgin, how is it so? Or, why is it thus? The phrase is used in liturgical contexts, in laments, in scribal commentary. It is a question without an answer. The text poses it, but does not follow it with explanation. The question is the form the memory takes. Not, this is what happened, but, why did this happen? And the question remains open. There is also the phenomenon of textual layering. A tablet will contain a composition from the Ur-3 period, followed by a commentary from the Isin-Lhasa period, followed by a scribal note from the Old Babylonian period. Each layer acknowledges the previous one, but does not claim continuity. The tradition is preserved as accumulation, not as coherence. The scribes are not claiming to understand the old texts, they are claiming to remember them. One late text describes the gods as Dingir Gibil Me'esh, the new gods, contrasting them implicitly with Dingir Sumun, the old gods. The new gods are those worshipped in the present, the old gods are those remembered in the texts. The distinction is not between true and false, or between major and minor. It is between present and past. The old gods are not denied, they are historicized. If memory can be preserved without explanation, what function does the memory serve? And if the Sumerian scribes taught their students to remember the names of gods whose nature was no longer known, what were they preserving? History? Or the shape of a question that could not be answered?